I used to work as a bikini barista up in Washington State, and let me tell you, it was not my finest hour. Now, no offense to anyone who really enjoys doing that kind of thing for a living. The tips are great, and if you have good regulars, you're riding a gravy train. But for me personally, I was in a really rough stage of my life. I needed the money, like really, really badly, and I definitely wouldn't have gone into that line of work otherwise. The first major problem is you get a whole lot of creeps, and sometimes you can't immediately tell if someone's going to be a jerk. A car full of college boys whistling at me and asking for extra cream is expected, and they're manageable. But some sweet older man asking me, "Is your effing mama proud of you?" before deliberately revving dust in my face, it hurts more when you're not expecting it, or you let your guard down long enough to not expect it. The other big problem was that I was way out in the middle of nowhere, essentially. Not exactly wilderness territory, but our customers were very rural, and that wasn't always a good thing. Most of my regular customers were nice folks, like the guy old enough to be my grandfather, who always made sure that I was okay and never made me feel creeped on. Then there was the farm kid in his late teens who'd blush like a rose whenever he ordered from me, and always tipped big after giving me the same shy, "Thank you, ma'am." But then some weren't so nice, and I got a feeling that they only stopped by out of necessity than any kind of affection. One of those guys was this really skinny guy who looked to be in his 40s maybe. He always looked at me with a kind of spite in his eyes, like he was judging me for what I was doing. Or maybe more how I was doing it, but you get the idea. He'd come by most days, same scowl on his face every time, and although he definitely wasn't as bad as some of the other jerks who spontaneously pulled in after seeing the sleazy Bikini Barista sign, he definitely wasn't my favorite customer. Then this one day, a car pulls into the shack, a new one, and this really nice-looking guy gets out and orders a coffee. We had like a little gravel parking lot just next to the one-window shack, and folks would often pull their cars in and drink their coffee before driving off again. The guy parked and walked over to the shack and was just about the friendliest, most kind-hearted person who'd ever visited. He had a total grandpa vibe, and he obviously dyed his hair the super conspicuous black, but he was so sweet that you totally forgive him for it. He asked about my day, about the job, but the thing that really made me like him was how he asked what I wanted to do after working the bikini shack. I don't want to bore you with all the dreams that I shared with him, but just talking about it really gave me hope for the future. When he was done with his coffee, my new grandpa wished me all the very best luck in life and then headed back to his car. Before he left, he popped his trunk and started doing something, but before I got to be nosy about it, skinny-faced, spiteful man pulls into the lot in his truck. My new grandpa closed the trunk and got back into his car before the skinny guy could mean mug him, and boy was I glad of that, cause I'd have ended up hating him even more. But for real, the skinny bearded guy watched my new grandpa drive off the whole way like he was trying to give him some "don't come back" vibes or something. Like I said, I am seriously hating on skinny guy, and I did my best not to spill his coffee all over him as I passed it down from the window. Then for the first time ever, the guy says something other than "coffee, black," and asks me if I'm working alone. For obvious reasons, this is by far the single scariest question I used to get asked. Sometimes people were just concerned for me, and I get that. But if anyone asked who might have had bad intentions, I always lied and told them no, that my boss came by 3 times during my shift to collect bills and drop off change. That wasn't true. My boss lived down in Vegas for 9 months out of the year, but I knew that it warned off some of the pervier guys who might try and hang around to pick me up after hours. So when the skinny guy asks, I tell him no and that I don't work alone, yada yada yada. He responds by spitting, grinning, and replying with, "Yes, you do." He either saw right through my lie or had stopped by enough times to know that no one showed up except for me and the other girl who worked there over the weekend. The guy then asked me how I was getting home after my shift, and again I lied, telling him my boss was driving me home. I don't know why I leaned on that excuse after he'd figured me out. I guess I thought if I just repeated it enough, he might believe me. But the reality was, I cycled to and from the shack every day. I knew he saw through that lie too. I didn't think that he'd ever seen me on my bike or anything, but the way he smirked definitely showed that he didn't believe me. And after that, he made his usual order, then paid and took his drink without saying another word. He'd never been that creepy in the past, but there's a first time for everything, I guess. I just didn't want his first time creeping to be my last night alive, you know? Sounds kind of melodramatic to some, but worse things happen to young women every single day. So come to the end of my shift, I'm really tense. I had a real bad feeling in the pit of my stomach that Skinny Guy was going to try something as I rode home. So you can imagine how awful it was to see his truck parked at the side of the road, maybe only 100 yards in front of me as I turned onto the road while on my bike. I told myself that I'd just ride past him, and if he tried anything, I'd just call the cops and try to wave down any passing cars so he couldn't try anything. Then what do you know? As soon as I ride back, he starts shouting something out of his window to me. I had earbuds in, and back then I had the kind that you literally jammed into your ear hole until you were basically deaf. So although I had no idea what he said, I figured that it couldn't have been good, so I just upped my pace and rode past him, praying that he wouldn't just knock me off my bike or something. Then the next thing I know, he's speeding up alongside me, and I'm thinking, oh my god, this guy's gonna smash into me any second. Then, he pulls ahead of me, and then turns into the side of the road real quick to totally cut me off. It was real sudden, and I braked so hard that I felt myself about to fly over the handlebars for a second. After that, he got out of his truck, but instead of turning around and just riding off, I was so angry that I just went off on this dude. I was all like, what do you think you're doing? You're a total psycho, I'm calling the cops. And all this other stuff. And the guy just waited until I stopped talking, then gave me this total, come with me if you want to live, Terminator speech. I can't remember what he said word for word, but it was basically something like, there's a man waiting for you down the road there. He has rope, handcuffs, and a bunch of other non-vehicle related tools in his trunk. I think he's going to try and kidnap you, so throw your bike in the back, get in my truck, and if he's still there when we drive past, you can call the cops from my truck. Just hearing him say that was terrifying, but I was still faced with a very scary problem. That could have all just been nonsense to get me into his car, you know, like how Ted Bundy or whoever used to lie to girls to get them into his van. But then at the same time, Skinny Guy had been visiting the Bikini Shack for months by this point, hadn't said more than 2 words to me aside from coffee black, and never, ever tipped. That wasn't textbook creep behavior, not by a long shot, so either he was playing some super patient long game, or he was actually telling the truth. And for some reason, I went with the latter. Call it a woman's intuition, call it a sixth sense or whatever, but something about the guy's little speech rang true. So even though on paper I should have just declined and kept on riding home, I did as he asked and got into his truck. I told him that he better have a damn good story to follow up with, and oh boy, did he ever. It wasn't even much of a story, really. He just kept on driving, telling me to keep an eye over his shoulder as he drove. Then what do you know? I see a car at the side of the road with a man leaning on the side of it. It was exactly the same car my new grandpa had been driving, and only the person leaning up against it looked way different. Totally different clothes, seemed at least 20 years younger. But then somehow, even though I only got a split-second look at him, I was convinced that it was the same old sweet man that I'd adopted as my new grandpa. I was stunned, literally stunned, to the point that I didn't even feel all that relieved to have been given a ride past him. I was just so disappointed in him and in myself too, having been so deceived that I was about to place my trust in totally the wrong place. Skinny Guy said that when he'd rolled up to pick up his coffee at the same time my adopted grandpa had been there, he'd seen all kinds of creepy looking stuff in his trunk. Nothing to be alarmed about right away. People carry rope around and they're not all serial killers or whatever, but handcuffs too. And then after seeing the guy parked at the side of the same road he'd probably knew I took to get home, he figured that he'd better come back and warn me. He said the thing that really set alarm bells ringing was how he'd changed his clothes. Still the same car, but totally different clothes. No one with pure intentions has a change of clothes, handcuffs, and rope in their trunk. I mean, I still don't know entirely what the guy's deal was, but Jesus Christ, it doesn't really help thinking about what he'd have done if he got his hands on me. I didn't work at the Bikini Shack for much longer, and I went from keeping just that one can of pepper spray at the shack to open carrying a gun out of pure terror the guy would come back. My boss took a huge issue with that, and we clashed on it, and that's how I ended up just getting fired. But it suited me fine. If he hadn't have fired me, I'd have just quit on the spot anyways. And that was my cue to question pretty much all conventional wisdom regarding women's safety. I know it might seem obvious to some of you, but that was when I learned about nice guys. And not even just the online kind, the real life kind, that lull a girl into a false sense of security before completely and violently turning on them. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.